Welcome everyone to day 2 of ISART. Yesterday we set the baseline with a series of tutorials on the current state of 5G, a fireside chat giving us unique perspectives and efforts being undertaken by NIST, NTA, and CU Boulder. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Joe Evans, he shared the latest DoD efforts spearheading this push to operate in a zero-trust network environment. And although we were virtual, there were numerous opportunities for you, the attendees, to interact one-on-one with our speakers during live Q&A and the breakout room. This morning, we'll feature our framing panel of experts with experience in government, industry, and academia, diving deep into what zero trust means with the spectrum world and the known risks that exist today at that intersection between 5G new radio and zero trust networks. The technical core of the program is contained in the next 4 panels over the next 2 days, which will examine 5G networks from the perspective of ways to design the 5G radio layer for resilient services. That will be this afternoon. Then on Wednesday, we will cover our second technical panel on how to implement secure and resilient technical solutions during deployment. And third, the how to ensure resiliency with the network's operations, including handling the spectrum. And then on Thursday, we will cover the 4th topic on monitoring and data collection and how that can and should provide valuable input and feedback into the design, deployment, and operations, which we discussed the prior days, to improve the resiliency of the network. And then finally, we will have a wrap-up panel on Thursday afternoon, which features polymaths who will help us draw new insights and connections across all those different panels and our technical speakers and identify potential new research areas and hopefully add to the history of ISART, triggering important out-of-the-box thinking, innovative ideas, and novel solutions. Also, with several of the panels, we'll be privy to some deep dives into some technical talks so we can get a better hands-on feel for the boots-on-the-ground type effort in each of those areas. But before we start the day, just a few logistics to remember for not just today, but the rest of the week. Our virtual ISART 2020 is structured in two-hour blocks each day. The organizing committee has worked hard to find ways to incorporate tools for real-time interaction amongst the panelists with in-depth preliminary talks, highly interactive Q&A sessions, and opportunities for networking conversations in our breakout room. Please feel free to ask questions online during the presentations and panels. And remember to spell out any acronym. If you look over on the right, there's a Q&A button. Please look at the questions already listed and vote if you would like to hear more about that particular question. The panel moderators will endeavor to pull questions based on those with the highest interest. We will also take some of those unanswered questions into the breakout room. The breakout rooms are the last half hour for each of those 2-hour blocks. Those are reserved for the breakout room. We hope that these rooms replicate to the extent possible in a virtual environment that critical personal interaction with the speakers and other participants that had always been a hallmark of ISART. After each panel concludes, the panelists and speakers from each session will exit from this Blue Jeans events and then head over to the Blue Jeans meeting platform for those breakout rooms. For those of you who are able to and using our brand new ISART app, all the information and links are needed to find the breakout rooms are in that app. Just go to that session and click on the link. For non-app users, the ISART confirmation email sent out Friday has quick links that contains both a link and a phone number for those breakout rooms. For each breakout room, there will be a host from the conference to help you there if needed. If you run into technical difficulties, please reach out to our conference services staff listed in that confirmation. Just a quick technical note, the code to access the main sessions, these main sessions for each Blue Jeans event is the same each day. So if you have a problem with one link, just go to the next comparable link and click on that. We did have that issue yesterday. We do apologize for that glitch in the link to Dr. Evans' keynote, which prevented or delayed some people from accessing the afternoon session. To address that, we will be posting that one video from yesterday's session as soon as possible so that those who are affected will be able to view it. So just remembering that the ISART app will allow you to reach out and connect with each other. By default, the only information people will see on the app is your name and affiliation. So if you're open and interested in chatting with others, networking, exchanging virtual business cards, please remember to go to the app and add whatever information you're comfortable sharing. I'd like to encourage all of you to use these interactive tools to ask questions, converse with our panelists and presenters in the breakout rooms, and connect with other attendees. Just one quick other regret, we did run into technical difficulties getting the 5G equipment vendors and suppliers involved with ISART this year. We're truly sorry, and we will be sure to have their involvement for next year's ISART. So please take advantage of the app and all the opportunities our virtual conference offers. And with that, we will get underway with our first panel, our framing panel, to discuss what zero trust means within the spectrum world today and the known risks that exist. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, Brian Tremont. He is widely recognized as one of the nation's top media and communication lawyers. He served as chief of staff at the FCC under Chairman Michael Powell, and he is now a managing partner at Wilkinson Barker & Auer LLP. There, he leads the strategy and implementation of WBK's communications, media, and technology team. I encourage you all to use the app and the program to peruse the complete bio information to learn more about him and all our amazing panelists. And now, I will turn this over to our esteemed moderator, Mr. Tremont.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be with everybody this morning. I'm very excited about the group we have together on this panel. As Melissa alluded to, they bring vast experience in the regulatory, government, and business sides of spectrum management, both at NTIA, the FCC, among international regulators, DoD. And so I'm very excited to get their perspective on what framing the zero trust relationship means today, vis-a-vis the spectrum and the radio layer in particular. And one of the most important things is recognizing and naming the risk and vulnerabilities in each layer of the network so that we can better do a job of comparative risk assessment, both for purposes of making public policy, but also in terms of making investments in our networks and assessing where we go from here from a policy perspective. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First up will be Lisa Porter, who's the president of Logic and the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Next, we'll go to Anna Gomez from Wiley-Ryan, then William Webb from the University of Cambridge, then Henning at Columbia, and Charla, formerly of Verizon and now CISMAC co-chair. I want to encourage all of you, all 79 attendees out there, to do send in your questions. Otherwise, you'll be subjected to the questions that I have prepared in advance. We'd love to hear what you all are thinking around the country and around the world as you listen in this morning. But the run of show will be each of the panelists will speak for a few minutes about framing this question, and then we will turn it over to questions from you or from me, depending on where we are. So welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa first.
Good morning, everyone. So thank you, Brian, for the intro, and hello to everyone out there in virtual space. I'm going to confess that I'm not really good at this, so you'll all have to just put up with me and my weird, awkward, shifty looks at the camera. But anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here. I thought I would start off by framing zero trust a little bit, as Brian alluded to, and making sure we're all on the same page regarding what does it really mean fundamentally. And I like to point out to folks that zero trust isn't just about networking or cybersecurity or 5G. Right? It's really a fundamental philosophy. It can be applied to any complex system, including things like supply chain management. And there have been a lot of erroneous commentaries I've noticed in the press recently, some of the press, about what zero trust is. As it's sort of gained some buzz and people start talking about it, the inevitable occurs. And people start kind of going off and talking about stuff they don't know what they're saying. So some of you may have seen zero trust commentary where people say, oh, it's really a misnomer, and you know, it really isn't about zero trust because you have to trust people to get stuff done and blah, blah, blah. No, it really is what it means. Zero trust is all about recognizing that trust is a vulnerability that can be exploited. So you have to eliminate trust as your goal when you're designing complex systems. That's really what people have to embrace when they embrace the zero trust philosophy. So when you think about it, if you decide you trust something, then you're basically assigning zero risk to that thing. And once you do that, you've introduced a vulnerability. So pursuing trust is not what you should be doing. And you cannot both ask for a trusted system and claim that you're pursuing a zero trust approach. Those things are oil and vinegar, or oil and water, sorry. So you got to let that whole paradigm of pursuing trust go. And the reason I make a really big deal about this is because people are trying to hold on to both, and it's really problematic to do so. Now, I do want to point out that zero trust is actually not a new concept. People talk about it, and they talk about it as though it was invented in 2010 or maybe 2004, depending on different literature you read. That's not really true. I mean, zero trust has been something that is really ingrained, if you will, in the culture of the intelligence community. So anybody who's ever watched a good spy flick kind of knows that. But ironically, back in the mid-2000s, when the intelligence community, the national security community as a whole was really grappling with cybersecurity, they kind of forgot about the fundamental principle that they applied to a lot of other things. And so at that time, and I was the director at IARPA at the time, so I kind of can speak to this with some authority. At that time, a lot of the senior leaders were asking, how do we build secure cyber systems? And some of us were speaking up and saying, no, that's the wrong question, right? The right question you should be asking is, how do we operate in systems that are inherently not secure? But unfortunately, you know, this desire to build secure, trusted systems was so appealing, and it drove a lot of the decision making to the point where there was a real problem and a real devastating result. And that devastating result was someone that you probably have all heard of, a gentleman named Edward Snowden. He actually did unbelievable damage to our national security because people had not embraced zero trust, but rather had tried to develop perimeter-based, purely trusted systems. That was really the consequence. And so when people ask why zero trust, I say a really good answer is Edward Snowden. So I'm emphasizing this because today, where we are today, we're at a pivotal point in next generation communications. We're all here talking about 5G. We're all very excited about what 5G has to offer, and we should be. We recognize it's a transition from discrete to continuous compute and comms, and it's all wonderful, but it's all very complex, and we have to be very thoughtful. And there's a strong push by some people, particularly in policy domains and particularly in senior positions in government in some places, that we should be going after trusted networks. And you'll hear that over and over again, trusted 5G networks, trusted supply chains, trusted suppliers. And I'm trying to raise people's awareness that that is actually a very dangerous approach to thinking about how we're going to execute in our complex real world systems. So if we actually are foolish enough to think that we can build truly trusted 5G environments, then what we're basically going to be doing is building our own Maginot Line. And for those of you guys who are history buffs, you know what the Maginot Line refers to. You know that France learned the hard way, the lesson of putting a lot of effort into building a false sense of security. So we don't want to fall into that trap. And I think it's really important for people to stop talking about desiring to build trusted systems, but rather fully embrace what is actually very powerful and empowering, the concept of, okay, I am not going to assume I can trust things in my system. That's not even my goal. My goal is to develop architectures that enable me to move in an environment in which I cannot trust anything. And of course, that then leads us to a risk-based approach, which Brian actually referenced in his opening comments. It's all about applying data-driven, quantitative risk assessment and risk management techniques. That's what zero trust is really about. It is not a promise to make things perfectly secure, right? That is not what zero trust is saying. It's saying, look, this is the better way to operate in a system in which things are very complicated and therefore cannot be trusted. The one final point I wanted to make before I turn it over to Anna, I think is next in the list, is to say, you know, when you hear people like myself and others talking about zero trust, we come from the intelligence community, we come from the Department of Defense. We often think about trust in the security in the context of adversarial attacks, right? Malicious attempts to take down networks and to degrade things. But zero trust isn't just about preventing malicious attack. It's also about preventing stupid, right? Or not so stupid. Human errors, right? We know that, in fact, human error is often a much greater problem for us to deal with and to think about. Poorly designed or poorly operated systems are just as problematic as systems that are under malicious attack. So we have to keep that in mind. Zero trust is a way of thinking that applies broadly. It basically says, hey, things are going to go wrong. There is no part of my system I can ever count on with 100% certainty. I cannot assign zero risk anywhere. I have got to think about constantly understanding through measurements and transparency and awareness, what is my risk? Let me assess it, let me mitigate it, let me understand the best ways to apply that. Understanding, of course, that nothing's ever going to be perfect. So I think zero trust is a really nice way of reframing how we approach complex networks, but we've got to all make sure we understand that means we're abandoning this frankly naive and dangerous goal of trying to build trusted, perfectly secure systems. So with that, I'll turn it over. Thanks for letting me give some opening comments.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to jump back in, Anna, and I want to ask a quick follow-up of Lisa before we get to you, Anna, if that's okay. I know you're chomping at the bit down there to talk, Anna, but okay. So Lisa, I thank you. That was terrific. One of the things, though, you referred to it a couple times is how naive and dangerous the approach is that we're trying to build trusted supply chains or trusted networks. Do you believe as a policy matter we shouldn't pursue components of that, or do they not contribute to an overall race-based or risk-based approach? Or do you? So are you saying zero trust is to the exclusion of these other things, or that these other things are not a solution? I guess
right. So it's more the latter, of course. So people who've not taken a logic class and don't understand that A implies B doesn't mean B implies A. People sometimes take these comments to mean that we're saying, oh, you can go ahead and use anybody because it's equally the same. No, obviously you eliminate the obvious sources of threat. You don't purposely go out and engage with clearly untrusted suppliers, right? And we know who those are, and we know that there are bad actors out there, or we know there are suppliers that are incompetent. You don't go after incompetent suppliers either, who don't know what they're doing. That's just as bad. But you can't, by contrast, say, okay, now that I've gotten rid of them, I now have a trusted system. That's my concern, and that's the Maginot line, that example that I like to give, okay, as sort of that, keep that in mind. Just because you eliminate the obvious stuff doesn't mean you've got a secure system.
Very good, thank you. I just wanted to tease that out a little bit, lest we have some questions on that front later. All right, with that, thank you, Lisa. That was terrific, and I will now turn it over to Ms. Anna Gomez.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everybody. I have to say, it's hard to follow Lisa. That was really an amazing way to frame our conversation. As Brian said, I am Anna Gomez. I am a partner in the Telecom Media and Technology Practice Group at Wiley-Rein. I also co-chair our Unmanned Aircraft Systems practice, although I guess that is tangential to our conversation today. Before I came to Wiley, I was the deputy administrator at NTIA for a little over 4 years. So I am delighted and humbled to have been invited to join this wonderful conference. I'm delighted because I feel like I left a part of my heart at NTIA when I left. It's such a wonderful organization full of talented, hardworking, and can-do people. And I should also mention that I am sure I am not the only one chagrined not to be able to be there in person, as visiting Boulder is always such a treat. And I'm humbled because as a non-engineer and a non-technologist, I never expected to be addressing the ISART, which I see as an elite engineering and technical conference, and I am neither an engineer nor a technologist. When Pierre and Rebecca reached out to me to talk about zero trust in the next generation radio layer, I thought they might have been dipping into some of the edibles that are now legal in Boulder. After all, what can I add to this conversation? But as I thought about it, I hope that I can contribute from a policy experience based on my 25-ish years in telecom, 12 years at the FCC, 4+ years at NTIA. So Lisa already laid out the concept of zero trust, so I'm not even going to try to do that. But one of the things that I would underscore is that eliminating trust in the radio layer means doing more than just being concerned about traditional cyber hygiene. It is about figuring out where the vulnerabilities lie, hopefully as you're designing the architecture, and how zero trust applies to those vulnerabilities. We have experience from our prior networks and from prior studies, we have standards organizations, we have research institutions like ITS and NIST and private R&D that are all looking at these issues, and that's something that we should continue to incentivize. Just summing up, I'm going to actually paraphrase what Lisa said in her remarks at Silicon Flatirons last year, when she said, and if you disagree with me, you can say it later, I guess, that zero trust architecture is about resilience, which is something we all often talk about when we talk about our telecom network. And her message was, you need to wrap zero trust into your network architecture ahead of time, especially the more complex and interconnected the system is, which is what we are looking at as we look at next generation networks. So thank you again for inviting me. And I hope next time you invite me, we can do this in person. And I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, Anna, let me ask you a quick follow-up question. You referred to your distinguished career both at the FCC and at NTIA, where you did remarkably good work. We miss your contributions to government, I will say. You saw two models, well, more than that, probably in all the roles you've had, of institutional effectiveness in government. Lisa had a different component of that. Do you see the tools there to make the kind of comparative risk assessment across layers, and where do you think that sits? And is the FCC going to do that for commercial, and NTIA is going to help do that for government, or is it going to be like how do you feel about institutional capabilities and competence across these types of issues that we've been discussing this morning?
This is a really good question, and this part of the answer to this question, part of what makes it so difficult, is the massive scale of what we're talking about and how it touches on so many different regulatory institutions. So right now, I can name an alphabet soup of agencies that are looking at security one way or another in the multiple layers of our networks. And that's great, because it's good to have eyes. It's dangerous because what you don't want to have is some type of framework in which you have different regulatory agencies either freezing technology and time through regulation or imposing differing requirements that make it impossible to really innovate and coordinate. So is there a perfect place? I don't think there is. I think what you need to have is a coordinated and collaborative effort, which is a lot of how things have been done, right? A lot of what NIST has been doing in this area and NTIA have been doing in this area and DHS have been doing in this area has involved coordination, collaboration, multi-stakeholderism, relying on standards, relying on research in order to get to proposed solutions rather than individual regulatory activities.
I want to come back to this theme, I think, for the larger group, because I want to bring in the other panelists on this as well. But I think the issue of comparative risk assessment across the network and where the risk occurs, and then looking at it from a government network versus a commercial network versus a public safety network and where that all sits, I think is a really important thing that I'd like to talk about as we move on. So thank you, Anna, for that. William, you're up next. Take it from here.
Thank you very much, Brian. So I wanted to try and frame this now a bit more in the context of a radio system and ask, where are the key issues in terms of trust? So we make sure that we tackle the most important items and not spend too much time on items that are of very little significance. So I thought I'd illustrate it with looking at one of the services that's sometimes talked about with 5G, and that's remote surgery, the idea that you could be somewhere, the surgeon somewhere else, and they could be operating on you. So let's imagine you've had some kind of heart attack, you're in the ambulance, and you need some urgent surgery before you get to the hospital to keep you alive. The surgeon's in the hospital, and there's a radio link between the hospital and the ambulance, and that's being used to conduct this surgery. So what should you worry about most at that point in time in terms of the radio link? And I suggest you're not particularly worried about the Chinese eavesdropping or the Russians hacking into the system and trying to insert a chip into your brain rather than fixing your heart. What would I be worried about? I would be worried about coverage. This ambulance is rushing through an open area into some forests, and the radio link cuts out, And there I am with my heart wide open, critical insertion about to be made, and the coverage drops out. And if we think about it in our normal life with cellular systems, when it's not working, for most people, most of the time, perhaps 90% of the time that cellular is not working, it's a coverage issue of some sort or the other. And actually, with 5G, that could be worse than 4G, particularly for these kind of very high bandwidth services that need to be delivered in the higher frequency bands where the propagation is poorer, and so the coverage is naturally less. So actually, we may be in a situation where 95 or more % of the time where the radio link is not working well is actually down to coverage. The next category of problem, which I suspect is about 1/10 as big as the coverage problem, is the congestion issue. So there is coverage, but all the radio channels are being used by other people, and I don't get a channel, or I get much reduced bandwidth that's insufficient. That is an issue, of course. Hopefully less of an issue in 5G, actually, because some of the concepts like network slicing and others ought to be able to keep high priority channels with high bandwidths. And I hope that I have one of the highest priority channels there. So hopefully 5G will solve that particular problem. What else? Well, about another order of magnitude below that is just network failure. The network just falls over. Perhaps it's because there's been a software update that didn't quite go right. Perhaps there's been some kind of central switch meltdown. Perhaps there's been a local base station that's shut down because it's run out of power or some other kind of issue. And that can happen, but it's pretty rare, actually. Cellular networks achieve 99.99% reliability, typically, perhaps sometimes even better than that. So, it's a slight worry, but that wouldn't be one of my biggest concerns. And then at the very bottom of the stack, as I sort of hinted at the start, I think security would be the least of my concerns in that particular issue. Now, of course, I could have picked a different example, which was much more related perhaps to national defense or something where security would be a much higher concern. But I think for the vast majority of people, that's going to be roughly the order. The biggest problem is coverage, an order of magnitude less is congestion, an order of magnitude below that is reliability, an order of magnitude below that is security for most applications. So what can we do about it? Well, we can't just say we can't trust cellular and therefore we're not going to have remote surgery, because then potentially a service that could save lives might not happen. But the most obvious thing you can do in a situation like this is rely on multiple networks. And so the simplest solution of all, in a way, to these trust issues that I've highlighted is just to have the ability to roam across different cellular networks or onto different Wi-Fi networks. And indeed, if you look at, for example, the performance of Google Fi in the US, which does roam across 2 cellular networks and Wi-Fi, it is materially better than other networks, both in terms of its coverage, its capacity, and its reliability. So these kind of things perhaps are some of the easier solutions we might want to look at as we try and understand the issues of trust. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of these things later on.
William, can I ask you a quick follow-up question? So you sort of did a hierarchy of risk, coverage, congestion, network failure, and security. From your perspective, are the commercial providers' incentives to solve those problems aligned with what government would want to have happen? Or is it some place where there's a market failure where you think there's a role for government in ensuring those 4 primary threats? And you had said it's a certain use case, right? It's a commercial use case, but so it's limited to that. But do you think that the commercial entities' incentives align with government, or do you think government needs to do more to facilitate solving for those 4 risks?
Yeah, good question. So I think the short answer is no, the commercial incentives are not well aligned. For most of the cellular operators, by and large, they know that actually price is the key driver. So when we go to make a choice as to which cellular operator we're going to choose for our next contract, we look at who's the cheapest that provides whatever it is, 12 gigabytes a month and an iPhone. I'll choose them. So actually the incentive on the operator is to spend as little as possible on coverage and so on, as long as it delivers an okay service. Clearly, if they spend so little that actually word gets around that their service is absolutely awful, then nobody's going to choose them. But there's not that much incentive to expand coverage, and that's why we see all these government initiatives for rural broadband and so on, because the incentives are just not there. So if we want really highly reliable networks able to deliver remote surgery, for example, then we may well need to have some kind of governmental intervention of some sort to incentivize the right drivers to achieve that.
Excellent. So I know we have two commercial mobile carrier veterans executives here on the panel. So I'll be curious if we hear anything more from Anna and Charlotte as we go to the next round. Thanks, that was terrific. All right, I think Henning, you're up next. Are you ready for us?
Certainly, and thank you for kind of setting the stage in general terms. So let me, as kind of one of the more engineering-oriented participants, dive a little bit deeper into some of the issues that were raised earlier today. So I find it useful to look at two separate issues in this discussion. Namely, one is what has really changed compared to kind of previous generations of technology, and I'm not talking specifically about 5G. This is really broader than that. It's 4G largely and whatever comes after 5G. And secondly, what exactly are we looking at what system parameters are we looking at? Let me start in the first one. So interference at the radio layer is clearly not a new thing. I mean, we've had jamming in radio probably as early as we had radio. The difference, I think, was two facets. Namely, one, and this works in both directions. Namely, as we know, I mean, even in the Cold War, it was routine to jam shortwave radio stations that you didn't like, whether it was Moscow doing it or the U.S. jamming Cuban stations, whatever it happens to be. This was, even outside of a kind of a hot conflict, was quite common. And the advantage was that you could do that pretty much globally. I mean, you could have a few HF transmitters, and you could make it very difficult to receive Voice of America, for example, in large parts of the country. One of the primary differences, and this was alluded to earlier in the kind of remote surgery example in one way, is that it is now much harder to do that at scale. So in order for the Russians mentioned to do that, they have to be quite close in physical proximity. Having a transmitter in Moscow working at any cellular frequency isn't going to reach some street near London. So that's, in some sense, that inherently makes the job for an attacker much more difficult because physical presence or taking over an existing radio system is required to do these kind of wide-scale disruptions. Right? What is easier to do is to do very localized disruptions or other attacks in that, which are then also much harder to detect. It's very easy to see if somebody has an HF transmitter and locate it. It's very hard to find out if somebody just plopped down a almost invisible radio transmitter. Because that's really the second difference, is that the technology that you can use to deploy interference-causing devices is just so much more readily available, and not just to nation-state actors. It's just almost impossible to detect physically. It's not like you have to have a radio tower and so on. The second one, which I think it is useful, and previous speakers on the panel have kind of alluded to that we really should separately look at kind of the usual triad of the CIA triad, and not the agency confidentiality, integrity, and availability one. And I think at the radio layer, it is really primarily the availability case that we worry about, because I think we have learned that protecting confidentiality and integrity of information at the radio layer is just not appropriate. We tried that by prohibiting people to have radio scanners for confidentiality. That clearly was not terribly helpful. And the integrity, generally speaking, in injecting radio signals that emulate other radio signals, it's just too easy to prevent in that. So I think at the radio layer, in the CIA triad, availability really primary difference. And finally, I will say one difference that was alluded to goes beyond just the notion of carrier diversity is the notion of frequency diversity. It used to be that that communication devices had one radio transmitter operating at one frequency or frequency band at a time. Now, all of our devices, even the cheapest kind of cell phone, operate on have multiple radio transmitters and are frequency agile, meaning that it is quite possible to rapidly switch to a different frequency, different transmitter, different tower, possibly at reduced capacity and at reduced performance. So having devices that are frequency agile and can circumvent radio disturbances of various sorts, both intentional and otherwise, is one of the key design characteristics where the lower radio layer interacts with the higher layers. And it's often the higher layers that are not terribly good at doing that. We've all experienced where our Wi-Fi connection connects to a supposedly functioning access point, which provides RF energy, but no internet access. And we can't get our laptop or whatever to connect to a weaker but functioning radio access point on the Wi-Fi part. And similar issues exist at the cellular layer as well. So we should see that as a combined issue that where the radio layer needs to interact with the upper layers.
And to build a little bit off the question I asked William, do you think on the frequency diversity dynamic, is the commercial sector adequately incentivized to create frequency diversity for its network today, or is there a role for government in that? And it's obviously maybe a different question for government users, but do you think that the commercial entities' incentives align with government on frequency diversity? You had a lot of things in here, but I'm going to tease that one out since we can tie it back to Williams.
Yeah, so I think as I mentioned before, frequency diversity often these days, because of a historical notion of evolution, that different carriers have historically acquired different frequency bands, even 4G. Just Sprint, when the old Sprint had, obviously lots of 2 gigahertz spectrum, and AT&T and some of the kind of AT&T Verizon have more low band spectrum and so on. So they've each had niches of spectrum. And so I think there are two notions that I think are important. One is, I don't think there's the incentive. We've seen that only after natural disasters do carriers typically allow unauthenticated roaming, or do roaming allow even authenticated roaming. And that I think needs to be just much more part of routine operations, just because frequency diversity also implies carrier diversity largely. But it also means for devices. I think this is getting better, but with 5G, I suspect we'll be back to an environment where devices are not necessarily optimized to operate across frequency bands because of a difference, particularly cheaper devices. They often have a limited number of bands that they support, so they're optimized for a particular carrier, even if they provide basic functionality across carriers. So they're nominally not carrier tight, but practically they are. And it's often difficult to tell from a user perspective. How many people know how many bands their current cell phone supports? It's not advertised typically, both for government users and for more critical infrastructure type users. What you would have to dig deep into the specs to find out which bands are supported on that, which gives you that at least theoretical hardware diversity.
It's a great party trick, though. You go up to people and ask how many bands their phones operate on. They love that question. It just really gets it's remarkable.
We'll see
how that works in the breakout rooms. At any rate, I'm going to turn it over to Charla as our last panelist, but I want to also encourage our panelists to have comments ready to what other folks have said. I've asked a few additional questions, but to the extent you all want to comment on what others have said, I don't want to diminish any organic conversation. And we have started to populate some questions from the attendees as well, so we'll turn to those. But before we get there, batting cleanup, Ms. Charla Rath. Madam Sysmac Guru. You're still muted, Charla. There you go. Okay, there you go.
There you go. Good. Thanks. Thanks. Appreciate it. And I was debating whether I should just go ahead and answer all the questions that I think have arisen from the various comments made here. But I am going to stick just a little bit to some of my prepared comments. First, thank you to the organizers. This has been great. Like Anna, I have a very fond place in my heart for NTIA. It's actually where I started my telecom career on Spectrum, working on UHF taboos. So for those of you old enough to know what those are, you can ask questions of me about it in the Q&A later. I am not an engineer. I'm not even a lawyer. I'm one of those nameless sort of people here. I've been primarily focused on the policy issues. Starting my career really in the radio layer and looking mostly at the efficient use from an economic perspective, which, those of us who have studied economics view the technological efficiency as being a component of economic efficiency. And later then when working for Verizon, I actually was very focused on the acquisition of Spectrum. So the early part, what we were doing in the 90s was really looking at a way to get around and get through the block allocation system, which essentially was set up to manage one of the risks in the radio layer, which is interference. If you could set up, know what was going to be in each block and know what the technical criteria were, you could actually presumably manage your interference in a highly regulated approach. So what happened is people started thinking, shouldn't there be greater flexibility? There's this increased demand for spectrum. We need to get beyond this. So the engineers in the room in these conversations would always be like, but you're going to create problems with interference. And those of us on the other side will say, well, you'll just fix that with technology. So, again, I'm simplifying the discussion. It was much more robust and well done than that. But it essentially really a lot of our changes, particularly in the mobile industry, were based on this idea that we needed to figure out ways to provide economic incentives to use spectrum more efficiently. So, as I said, interference has been seen as a key vulnerability of the radio layer, made worse not just by these more modern approaches, but by the increasing number of radio systems and devices, which really gets to one of the fundamentals of 5G. When people used to ask me, well, what do you think 5G is? It is to me, it was a combination of things, one of which included an incredible increase in the number of devices that you might be seeing. And everybody on the panels and everywhere has been talking about that. That is really key to what 5G is going to look like. It's also going to be an incredible increase in the number of people, organizations, you name it, that are going to be operating at very high bandwidths simultaneously. So those two things together are, I think, what is, going back to what William was saying and what Henning was saying both, is going to create, a fair amount of the risk in the radio layer. It's actually, how do you manage that piece? How do you manage that growth? Later in my career, where I spent the time expanding Verizon's footprint, and by the way, just to address one of William's points, we went from covering when I started, we covered around 90% of the population of the United States. And anybody who knows how the population is distributed in the United States would know that we actually are a fairly rural country. In the sense that I think it's something like 50 people per square mile is what the average, with incredible pockets in cities. So it was really easy to cover the cities, not so easy to cover rural. By the time I left, we covered 98% of the population of the United States. Every percentage, some of those percentages were actually through a program that Verizon had. And, you get very few people and a lot of land for the coverage that we got. So I agree, coverage is an issue. I also think, I'm not quite sure they're the same thing, but I think capacity is also an issue. And, William was talking about congestion. I am concerned that, the trade-off in spectrum from a physics point of view is very clear. The higher bandwidths actually give you more capacity, but they also create problems with coverage. So in a sense, what again, we've seen some of these issues resolved through technology, through antenna technology, through processing. But that really, to me, is the dichotomy here as we go into the 5G era. How do you actually get the kind of coverage you need at the same time you get the kind of capacity you need? There are going to be a lot of things that can operate at lower frequencies with great coverage, but I would argue that surgery example that's given, depending on the kind of surgery it is and the kind of MRIs you might be needing to pull up and all of the different things you might have, that's a pretty high capacity type of example. So where are you going to be able to do that you get the kind of, coverage, and how are you going to solve for that problem? So in any event, I'm going to skip through some of my comments because I've already spent a little too much time here answering some of the other questions. But just the final point I wanted to mention is, as Brian mentioned now, my latest gig is as co-chair of the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, which has one of the worst acronyms you can imagine, CSMAC or CISMAC. And one of the things that we just adopted in our recent July meeting was on unique identifiers. And what was interesting about that is I think there was a lot of sense, well, this will solve all the problems. But in fact, what the CSMAC found and what the committee that Brian was actually co-chair of found is that it makes sense to do it in some instances. In some instances, it doesn't make sense. And there are all sorts of issues involving security, privacy, cost that actually surround every single one of these solutions that you're going to try and do to have a zero trust at the RF layer. So with that, I will stop and we can move on. And Brian, I'm sure you're going to ask me a follow-up question. So.
Well, I just got so excited when you talk smack to the group like that, or CISMAC. Okay, anyway. So my follow-up question is, William talked about the 4 vulnerabilities and ranked them, and you responded a little bit about where their commercial incentives lie. Do you believe there is a role for government to enhance any of those 4 vectors, or do you think those are things that are better left to the commercial sector? The 4 being, coverage, congestion, network failure, and security.
Well, it's funny. I think there's probably a role in every one of them, depending on, where you're talking about. I mean, coverage in rural areas continues to be an issue. And by that, I mean the truly rural areas. The interesting thing is, I think one of the roles, and both Henning and William alluded to it, is making more spectrum available. I mean, what happened, for example, when I was at Verizon, we actually did create a fairly robust spectrum portfolio, but the first part of that was not on purpose in a way. I think had we had our choice back in the early days, we would have loved to have gotten more cellular spectrum, but instead we got PCS, and then we got AWS, and then we got went back down to 700. The decision at the time for Verizon to go into millimeter wave, though, was a very definite decision to diversify a portfolio, and I think many of the decisions after that have to do in answer to a lot of the questions that William put forward. So fundamentally, what can the government do? They can make more spectrum available in a variety of bands.
All right, thank you for that, Cheryl.
And that's the answer.
All right, well, I was gonna go out. Well, and I mean, Verizon built their network without universal service support, as I recall, and arguably has the best coverage. So I guess one question too, William pointed out, I think that government subsidizes the building of networks for coverage purposes, and they do for billions of dollars right now. But it's interesting that Verizon is not one of the companies that's taken that over the years. So an interesting tension on that point.
Yeah. No, and that's true. I don't know whether, honestly, I'm not sure what's happened in the last, couple of years on that, but absolutely true. When we were building, the coverage, the footprint in the 2000s.
And different build out rules and all that sort of thing back in the day, but understood. All right, I'm going to try and bring back in Lisa, if you don't mind, if you want to react to anything, Lisa, on this front.
Oh, I thought everybody had really great points to make. And I would actually say William's absolutely right when he emphasizes, there's a difference between use case, right? The DoD and the national security arena is going to think about problems differently. So, and I've made this point many times, the commercial sector is going to drive the technological advances that occur here. And the DoD and the national security arena need to line themselves up to take advantage of that and those advances and all the things that everyone was just talking about, and then try to tweak and tailor them to our specific use cases, which may be a little bit more weighted toward risks associated with malicious actors. But if we're thoughtful as a community, and technologists in particular, we try to design resilience such that we can accommodate as those dials turn, as William gave that one example that I thought was a really great example. So I just wanted to emphasize, I totally agree with that point that, the average person on a given day may be much more worried, and rightly so, about a coverage risk versus a security risk. On the other hand, you don't want to only have the ability to deal with one of those risks. Even very low risk but high consequence events, as we all know, are particularly important. And that's part of how good system engineers apply risk assessment techniques, right? It's all about managing risk and understanding the consequence if a risk materializes and how you minimize and mitigate that impact.
So I want to follow up on that because I do, for me at least, it's one of the most interesting questions is that, and maybe I am too institutionally focused, but whether or not there's somebody with vision sitting in, and I guess it's the government, that is looking at comparative risk assessment and institutional, and is in an institutionally effective role to help the government or to help the country solve for those risks. And whether, you just mentioned some cross-pollination between the commercial sector and the DoD. I suspect some will go the other direction. And do you think those lines of communication are there? Are the institutions effective? Or, God forbid, should there be a different institution? Or are the current tools the right way? I'd like to explore that a little bit for the audience.
So I don't want to hog the mic here. I'll say, God forbid, another institution is the answer. Just we have enough of those in the government already. I do think it's a really hard question. I think Anna touched on it, Charlotte touched on it, we all have touched on it. Part of the challenge as well, as you guys were alluding to, is the incentives, even on the commercial side, to enable the full ability, right, to build out what we need. And all of this becomes very complicated. So the short answer is right now there certainly is not one government agency that's doing that cross-cutting, holistic look. I think the government as a whole is still trying to just get its head around what does 5G look like and how do we take advantage of what's coming in a way that's beneficial to us and the benefits far outweigh the risks. So I'm not giving you a good answer other than to say I think it's what Anna had alluded to earlier. A lot of coordination and collaboration has to happen at the working level. And I'll just share with you and the audience that when I came into the job that I was that I just left recently in the department, I didn't know anything about spectrum and 5G. In fact, I thought it was a really boring topic, and I apologize to everybody on the line. I was like, well, spectrum, what is that? I'm a classically trained physicist. I'm like, give me quantum physics any day. But then as I dove into it, I said, man, this is so fascinating. And I got to know the folks at NTIA out in Colorado, and I got to know a lot of the folks at FCC. And I said, my goodness, our country has so many really smart people. This is real hardcore engineering. This is awesome. So I think we have the sort of raw ingredients as a country to pull together that expertise. The hard part is just allowing and enabling it to happen. And that may sound a little Pollyannish, but I really do believe from my exposure that we do have a lot of really talented people. I think if we can incentivize them to get together, can think holistically about how we approach this. I mean, to Anna's point, and she said it a lot more eloquently. So I'll shut up now, turn my mute on here.
All right, so I don't know if Anna or other would jump in. Anna, do you prefer quantum physics or 5G? And tell us why. But come back in from the institutional point, and I want to bring William and Henning in too, but Charlotte or Anna, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, actually, the thing I would say back to Lisa is I feel the same way about cybersecurity, and I think that there's the same sort of learning process that can take place for those of us who come more from the spectrum side. That every time I talk to people about the security issues, I have the same sort of reaction. There are a lot of things, even just preparing for this conference, it started making me think a lot about, various ways that I just think about spectrum, and that maybe, I need to rethink and have a new way of thinking about some things based on, frankly, not just cybersecurity, but this concept of zero trust. So I think it works both ways. But I do think there's a fundamental issue. And as I went back and reviewed materials and looked at the silicon flatirons, it seems that everybody keeps coming to the same thing, that there is this issue of maybe it can be solved through a multi-stakeholder approach that Anna talked about earlier. But I do think that is a fundamental issue in the government, is who's in charge in a way.
Yeah. So here's the issue with any one institution having control or some type of regulatory authority over the entire framework. And that is that each institution has a different mission. And that mission doesn't necessarily align with the holistic mission that our country should have of having a strong economy, having innovation, research and development, more than just a mission of security. And we see this every now and then when we see things come out like we should have a private 5G network, because that is the only way that we can have a truly secure network. That it doesn't work, although it may enhance a single agency's mission. So I find it very difficult to say we're going to have a single entity that is going to basically work to eliminate every vulnerability in, say, a 5G network. So I do think that the answer is some type of collaboration. To Brian's point is, but who's that person at the very top that is pulling together all of these folks? You have DHS that has the coordinating center. You have NTIA that has its various activities. You have NIST. My view, based on my past experience, is you should have somebody at the White House that has a portfolio that involves both your economic side and your security side, that is the one that ensures that all of the right parties in government and in the private sector and academia are talking to each other and working collaboratively towards this exact mission. And in the end, zero trust isn't going to be the silver bullet that says, boom, everything's secure and we're never going to have a problem. So that's I don't think that's not the mission that we should all be working toward. We should be working toward identifying the vulnerabilities, trying the best that we can to anticipate them, and where we do find them, well, also learn from our past mistakes. Where we do find vulnerabilities, how quickly can we resolve those issues? How do we ensure resiliency through lots of spectrum allocations, through diversity of suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things that all the stakeholders should be working toward, but that you can have a government person sort of at the top, making sure that all of these different missions and all of these different goals are being addressed by all of the different agencies that are involved in all of this. And then, let's not even talk about sector-specific agencies that are involved and are today in thinking through these types of vulnerabilities.
Great, thank you. And I think, William, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's right that in an ideal world, you could imagine a situation where you would have somebody who had perfect knowledge of everything and could sort of sit at the top and say, actually, what we need to do is invest in this, and this. These are the key issues. Let's get it done and let's make that happen. But as we've all kind of said, that's just not going to happen. If we look at what's happened in the last year or two, government has got very concerned about things like Huawei, which, as we sort of talked about, is probably an issue, but it's probably one of the smallest issues of all in terms of the bigger holistic picture. So I think it's very easy for the government to go down the wrong direction. So what are the solutions? Well, there's no easy solution, of course, otherwise we would have found it a long time ago. But one thing I think we are missing is some really good consumer information. So what I'd love to know, for example, is what's the best mobile operator for me, given that I live in one place, I work in a different place, I commute there via the train, I then go out on my bike and I like to have coverage on my bike when I cycle in the countryside. I use these certain applications and they have a certain degree of reliability. Which is the perfect operator for me? And of course, that's really hard for me to know without trying all 4 of them one after another. But equally, it's pretty straightforward for some kind of an app to measure where I go, to have knowledge of what the coverage and performance of the operators is, and to deliver that as a personalized recommendation to an individual. And I think that's where government could help. It's by actually making sure that the information is out there for people to make very well-informed decisions that fit their needs in terms of the trust they can put into the network, or the degree of reliability and so on that they need. And that can then send better signals to both the commercial entities, the operators and so on, but also in principle to government to understand where there are areas that perhaps people's needs aren't being met, and have a more of a sensible structure for intervention.
Great, thank you. Henning, you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, so I wanted to make it slightly more concrete, because I think some people might have been a little bit too polite to mention this, namely that we have also intentionally, we or some parts of government have intentionally disabled and defanged mechanisms that we actually had. Now I'll talk specifically about the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, in 2 dimensions. And namely one, and this goes directly from what William just said, is that one of the classical roles of a regulator, and I think this is different from some deputy assistant secretary in the White House type thing, and somebody with deep staff and long-term operational interaction with the networks, as opposed to more a policy sense. We used to have 2 roles, or has nominally 2, namely one is tracking network reliability. And that's been one of the earliest responsibilities for a regulator. And this is true for Ofcom, it's true for the FCC, it's true for others in that. Because in my mind, it's just like for air travel reliability, many of the big problems have indicators in small problems. If you have continuous reliability issues at a small scale, that's probably an indicator that maintenance and operations are not what they should be. So if there's a larger outage, either induced by nature or induced by an adversary, you're more likely to also fail that test. This is the usual problem when you look at airlines. It's the ones that have big accidents are usually the ones that have lots of maintenance problems that didn't cause an accident before. And we have essentially disabled that capability by choice. Reliability data, it's not just coverage. Reliability data is not disclosed to consumers. This is particularly important, I would say, because many of the networks were particularly for first responders that used to be operated by first responders, kind of your land mobile radio. In FirstNet, they're operated by a commercial carrier. There is, as best as I know, no public disclosure to the local fire department as to what reliability has been, both locally and largely. And it's true that many of the kind of the other thing that was done in the past was that there were reliability requirements, for example, for kind of the what used to be called NREC and then CISREC and so on, but also by state law, typically on service quality requirements, time to repair, reliability requirements for networks. We have abandoned that. As some of you know, there was, under the previous administration, an attempt to, for example, force backup power. We abandoned that effort intentionally. This was not this was an intentional political decision not to require backup power on cell sites. So there are numerous examples where the tools that we had available were chosen not to be deployed.
All right, I think we can talk about that for a while, I suspect, Henning. But let's throw it open. We've got some questions from our audience, and I'm going to take this first Most liked question from Mark Norton. To all the panelists, which specific elements of a trusted architecture, if any, do you envision to be replaced by a zero trust architecture? Device certifications, trusted certificates, encryption algorithms, something else? So who would like to jump in on that one first? Lisa is going to go. All right, thanks, Lisa.
Sure. So, hi, Mark. It's good to know you're out there. Mark Norton's one of the great government folks, so many of you guys know who he is. He did great work for us at the DoD for a long time. So I do think it's not, we have to be careful when we pose a question. First of all, there are no trusted networks, but I think what you're asking is, what are we talking about in terms of migrating the existing paradigm to a paradigm that incorporates zero trust? And it is kind of the types of things that you mentioned. I think most people are aware, or if you're not aware, you should know that NIST just put out a special publication, I think in February, basically going through zero trust in quite some detail in terms of what is currently understood, the types of approaches that can be used specific to networks. And those are the kinds of things we're talking about incorporating. Microsegmentation in general, I think, is a good approach. Understanding the user, the device, the application, all of those in context, dynamically allocating access, not one time means all time. All the things you can read about in the various literature that's out there, that's what we're talking about. And it is a shift. And of course, I think everyone here knows that Google has already at least demonstrated proof of concept in their Beyond Corp back in, I think it was 2014 when they started putting that in place. So the concept of how you implement a zero trust architecture in a network sense is not an unknown. That said, as we migrate to 5G and we have more and more devices and more use cases, and we introduce more virtualization and all the other stuff we've been talking about, it does become more complicated, and there's an issue of overhead, which I think was one of the other questions I saw in the Q&A, and that is certainly the trade, right? So that's why zero trust isn't saying we're going to make perfectly secure systems in a new way, right? It is abandoning the notion that you can have perfect security, and it is instead bringing in the classic system engineering approach of risk management and recognizing there is always risk, and then understanding where those risks are, trying always to improve your knowledge, developing mitigation strategies so you can limit the impact if a risk materializes. All of that kind of thing is what you're bringing to bear in a zero trust framework. I don't know if that. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was very helpful. I thought. Can I do two quick follow-ups though? So just for the group's benefit, can you briefly define or discuss what microsegmentation is, just so they have that as a benchmark?
Sure. Sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And then I want to have you talk a little bit about the risk management and the cost-benefit question, both as to commercial networks and to government networks.
Okay. So microsegmentation basically means you're basically bringing your perimeter, if you will, down to a very tight circle, and you're only allowing access to a very specific. Let's say somebody wants to access your printer. They're only getting access to that printer for a particular period of time. They can't touch anything else, even though you have decided, because you've looked at who they are, you've looked at their device, you've looked at the application that they're interested in running, you've decided that the risk is manageable, you're still only allowing them access to a very small element of your network. And that's one natural way, of course, to mitigate risk. So it's a term you'll hear a lot, and again, it's there are more formal definitions, which I don't have one written in front of me, but that's the essence of it, and you'll hear that word a lot. And in fact, the DoD is in our 5G strategy that we put out. I think we actually reference this concept of part of what the DoD is looking at when we talk about zero trust. And you had a second question?
The role of cost-benefit analysis in some of these conversations about relative risk and managing risk.
Yes, and that of course gets back to our other huge challenging question of that equation is going to vary depending on who's deploying the network, right? However, if you have in place the right data-driven tools, and again, these are going to be constantly updated. It's not you solve it once and you're done. This is the whole point of zero trust, is you assume you're never done, right? There's no finish line here. But whatever tools and algorithms you have, whatever measurements you're putting in place, and I think it was one of the panelists was talking about the need for much more dynamic radios, for example. There's a lot of technology that goes with this, right? Because the more you can respond, the more you can measure, the more you can sense, the more information you have, the better decisions about risk you can make. if I'm using the network from a DoD perspective, I may dial my cost-benefit trade analysis very differently than William does when he's driving. Again, he's got the heart attack situation, God forbid, in his ambulance. So you want to have an architecture that allows you to make those trades depending on what you're doing and what matters to you.
Great, thank you for that. That was interesting too, the way that conversation just draws back in Anna's point about emerging the economic and the security interests of the country in one entity, or looking at it, being able to look system-wide, either at DoD or at commercial. Public safety networks are a whole different animal because of the local control, with the exception of FirstNet that Henning referred to before. Do others want to come in on cost-benefit? Henning, looks like you're up, and then Charlotte, maybe?
Having done my fair share of them, or attempted to do in the networking space, cost benefit is like one of these things that really is a good idea in theory, and I mean by any economic rationale. In practice, certainly in the cases that I found, it is extremely difficult to do with high uncertainty situations. Because, and this is what we're dealing with really, namely we're dealing with probability estimates, for example, of what is the probability that an adversary, who followed or not, is able to disrupt a particular network, or what is or convert some other part of the infrastructure into jammers, or whatever the case may be. And since picking that number is essentially guesswork by necessity in that, since it's a way event, most of these estimates are really difficult. Secondly, estimating the cost is difficult simply because many of the defenses that you institute, and this is very similar to the issue for environmental regulations, they have other benefits. So for example, I mentioned backup power. That has an advantage, so that if an adversary is able to disrupt your electric supply, that provides protection against adversarial interference, but it obviously also provides protection against more mundane events like like a local power outage or a storm or whatever in that, and how do you attribute the benefits to that? And then thirdly, even measuring the benefit is hard because, you mentioned that there is a kind of government networks versus private network, but at the radio layer, I suspect within a number of years, that distinction will be for all but tactical networks that are built into tanks and things will basically disappear. They'll all be operating on commercial networks. It's true for utilities today that used to have their own LMR systems. It's going to be true for public safety. It's going to be true for local government. It has always been true for local government. They don't run their own network. Wireless networks, certainly not cellular network, and certainly not internet-based networks largely, and so on. So that distinction, how do you attribute value to disruption-free operation for that? I don't know how to do that. So cost-benefit analysis sounds good. In practice, it is essentially usually used to confirm your priors.
Okay, thank you for that. Shari, you want to jump in on this before I have to feel the need to discuss the perils of a mandated backup power plan at the federal level?
I'm hoping you will address that, but I just quickly wanted to go back to one of the things in Mark's original question about device certification. Anybody who's dealt with that process at the FCC knows that one of the issues with device certification is also then enforcement, because you can get a device certified, but then it doesn't necessarily, when it's sold, doesn't actually operate the way it's supposed to, according to the way the device that was at the commission was certified. So, so I look at that and I go, well, so how do you deal with that, particularly in an IoT world where you'll have all of these devices? And again, I'm talking about the interference piece of the risk and vulnerability that we've been talking about, not necessarily, something related to cybersecurity. So how do you actually go about ensuring that the devices that then are sold in the marketplace actually operate according to the way that they're supposed to. And maybe there is some sort of identifier, maybe there is a way in the network, but then that means the network becomes more costly. So there are a lot of issues there. And then on top of that, this gets back a little bit to Henning's point about things that the commission doesn't do anymore. You know, one of the things that it did do a couple of years ago was get rid of a lot of the field operations, which, you know, as an ex-Verizon person, you know, a lot of the engineers that worked in those groups were very helpful in tracking down interference. You know, we had an incident many years ago, but it was a huge incident in Manhattan where somebody put a device on, I forget, like the 30th floor of a Manhattan tower, and it knocked out 200 base stations in Lower Manhattan and New Jersey. And with the help of the FCC, we were able to track down, where that was. But, that may not happen now. There are certain other things that have taken place. But I just wanted to throw that in, that a lot of this, from the commission point of view, we still have to think about how do we make sure that whatever it says should be done actually happens.
All right, does anyone else want to jump in on that? If not, we have a question from Pierre that I feel like, I want to get invited back next year, so I need to ask the Pierre question. And this is for Henning. So you mentioned that for the radio layer, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, the main risk is availability. How do you think about spoofing on the integrity front and rogue base stations like Stingray, which remain a vulnerability even in 5G, the radio access network?
Yeah. And thank you for following up, because I think that probably when I said it first came across not quite right. And it's why I mentioned that we should really think of a radio layer as integrated, even if you think of it as truly just kind of physics, to pick up kind of the earlier comment from one of the panelists here, namely kind of electromagnetic radiation type thing and so on. In practice, spectrum is useless unless you can access it. And that plays out in two ways, and I wanted to emphasize this. Namely, one is that clearly we need base station authentication, and that my understanding, and others who are closer to that can correct that 5G itself is pretty good on that, but because of the fallback characteristics, because we're not just operating a 5G network in practice, we're operating a 2G through 5G network. If your adversary can force you to go to 2G, you're right back in vulnerability land because of all that I was mentioning, kind of the ability to spoof 2G towers, which actually made that trust assumption in a way what turned out to be short-sighted way. I do want to point out one additional kind of interlayer issue that we haven't talked about, namely that almost all new bands are going to be database driven. As in the availability of spectrum is driven by querying a database. Of a spectrum database. This is true for CBRS, it's true for many of the millimeter wave bands because of incumbents in that. And so when we think about spectrum availability, we need to think about what kind of a basic availability. Can I switch spectrum and so on? The inter-carrier availability, which I mentioned, which I think deserves more attention as well. But thirdly, if I wanted to disable a network, the best way to do that is to disable access to a spectrum database, because there's a single point of failure. No device is allowed to just connect without getting an AOK from the spectrum database. And now the spectrum, all the spectrum the electromagnetic spectrum may be available in theory, but no device can access those, at least most of those bands. Use that in that, and that to me, even though it's not a radio issue, is a fundamental vulnerability even at the spectrum layer.
So, and Henning, when you refer to that, are you thinking is 3.5 a model that you would point to? Is that going forward?
Yeah, when CBRS is 3.5 gigahertz, yeah.
Yeah, and in that case, there are multiple spectrum databases available. So you refer to a single point of failure. Is your premise that they would get behind the individual database or the coordinators and attack it at some central level? Is that the thesis?
Yeah, so because we had two vulnerabilities, namely one is, and one thing that I don't know in terms of how this is being handled operationally, whether a device actually is able to query multiple operators of a database or whether it is essentially tied to one, and how would I know ahead of time? So I may not be able to knock out everybody, but if I know that my local, my local National Guard unit is using one of the Spectrum databases, if I knock that one out, then obviously I have a disabled frequency access for that important user in that. And secondly, there's a backend database which feeds based on, for example, the military use for radars in the 3.5 gigahertz band. So if I can disable the feed into those multiple databases, then I have achieved kind of universal blockage, if you like, in that. So, and I think this has not been received the kind of attention that it deserves, because we have to, even though it's a zero trust network, we are essentially have to trust, and we forced by regulation, I have to trust the database. If the database tells me no, or particularly because no answer means no, it is not a fail-safe. I'm not allowed to use it unless I receive a positive go-ahead answer. I have created a system where I essentially need to trust the availability of a database, and for good reasons. There's good reasons not to allow transmitters to just blindly go ahead if they can't get a reliable answer.
I do want to bring other people in. This is a model that has been increasingly turned to by policymakers, has not yet been as proven in the marketplace on a commercial basis. And I'm sure that I would be remiss if I didn't point out to our CMRS friends would say that this is why it's so important to clear Spectrum completely, so you don't have to rely on a database like that. But does anyone else want to come in on this? Because it is an emerging field, obviously, of study here. Anybody want to come on in, William? Yeah, come on in, William.
Yeah, so Henning's absolutely right that if you have a single point of failure, then you have a risk in the system. But in a way, those are the easiest ones to defend because it's very clear they are a high risk, and you can add in any level of redundancy that you want. You can duplicate them, you can geographically distribute them, you can come up with all sorts of mechanisms that effectively ensure that they remain extremely reliable. So, I think it's important we identify them and we take the appropriate measures. But I think actually those are fairly tractable. The one that actually worries me the most is GPS. If you turn off GPS or take it out, then you'll take out all communication systems pretty quickly because they rely on GPS at some point for timing or something else, or for backhaul synchronization. Somewhere in that whole process, they will rely on GPS. And that's the thing that really is the weak link across the whole of our communication network systems.
Now we're talking. We had some GPS vulnerability in here. Lisa, you want to jump in on this? Anybody else? Can we say the L word, legato, amongst our group here? No. Sorry. Would anybody else like to come in on the database point? Oh, Henning, come on back. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just say quick on the GPS because it actually illustrates and I won't touch the legato issue, but I will touch the other one because, and I think this is favored of some participants, or possibly in particular Pierre, was talked just a minute ago. We talked about that the FCC certification process does not really cover operational devices. They cover what's submitted to the FCC approved lab. And we've had the problem that as a normal consumer, I have no way to verify, or even as an institutional consumer, like a public safety agency, how robust is a particular GPS device in this particular case against external interference. I'll just say, if it is so easy for legato to interfere by setting up a transmitter, building a transmitter that emanates in that spectrum is not exactly hard for anybody. This does not require either advanced knowledge or advanced technology. So if you want to disable GPS, if all it takes is a single transmitter in downtown DC to disable GPS there, we have a bigger problem than legato. So I would argue that the lack of robustness tracking by either the FCC or other agency is a big informational deficit that you mentioned market forces earlier, that doesn't allow agencies, in particular also private users like utilities that are critical, to make reasonable choices to pay more money for more spectrum robust, interference robust devices in that.
William wanted to come back in on that. I think there's a lot of market forces stuff to be unpacked. William.
Yeah, so just a very quick response. So actually, I'm not worried about interference really on that. I think taking out a small area with some interference is very unlikely. It's not a particularly big issue. I'm more worried about the whole system going down. So something catastrophic like a software upload to the GPS satellites that turned out to have a built-in vulnerability that meant they all suddenly turned off at a certain point in time. That is my key concern. I don't think we've got a particular interference problem to worry about anytime soon for cellular networks here.
Great, thank you, William. That was really an important distinction. So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to have a closing question for all of our panelists, and I'll give you a multiple choice. So, what is the one policy issue that most troubles you in 5G security, and what should policymakers be doing about it? Or if there's some area for additional research in the zero trust area that some of our audience might go off and write a paper about that you think would really benefit from some additional intellectual work. What would that area be? So I'll give the choice, and let's go in reverse order of the opening, and we'll have Charla start. Is that okay? Oh, surprise! You're on candid camera. Come on back on the screen here, Charla.
Actually, I don't know what happened to me. Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you, Charla.
You're back now.
You're back.
Oh, good. Okay, great. I wasn't sure. I realize that this is what the conference is about, but I think there is an interesting place for just further discussion of zero trust and RF, and really looking at really going in and maybe even looking at some of the things that we were talking about, like what kind of model is the best sort of model. You didn't really get into the question. You started to allude to it a little bit before about, is everything going to be database, or, is exclusive use gone forever, despite the fact that there might be some benefits as, in a zero trust world. I think there's a lot of work to be done and that maybe can be generated out of this conference on just looking at and maybe taking a good, the idea that database is going to be the future. Also, I find that somewhat difficult, because then what it does is it locks in place what could be very inefficient uses of spectrum. So in any event, I think, looking at that in the context of a zero trust networks just strikes me as being, I realize it's a little bit of a cop-out because it's saying just do what we're doing here, but I think we're only going to touch the surface here. And I think there could be some really interesting economic papers that come out that talk about the economics of spectrum that are tied into this issue.
Great, Charla. Thank you. Henning, you're up.
Yep. I would emphasize that we need a much better understanding of kind of the interlocking both vulnerabilities, namely kind of hidden dependencies that we may not realize, kind of as I said, the spectrum databases is a topic we talked about. And so we tend to organize engineering and research by layer, but many of the vulnerabilities are really cross-layer vulnerabilities. We need a much better handle on. And finally, I'd say when we talk about vulnerabilities, we should really be clear what we're worrying about. I think the panel has teased that out, but often the public discussion is just one big kind of security thing that is mentioned without really saying, are you worried about a nation-scale disruption? Are you worried about localized attacks? What is the threat model? Because without a threat model, there is no engineering and there is no even rudimentary cost-benefit analysis.
That's terrific. And of course, it plays to one of my hobby horses, which is the importance of cross-layer and interdisciplinary approach to a lot of these issues. And the University of Colorado and I sort of been very dedicated to those ideas. So thanks for that, Henning. It's great. William, you're up.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think I actually pretty much align with Henning. I think we need research in many areas, and of course there's lots of great research still going on and is very much needed in interference management and these other kinds of things. But actually it strikes me that the key question really is what sort of levels of reliability do we actually need and are prepared to pay for, either as a nation or as a commercial entity, and therefore what kind of levels of intervention are going to be needed in order to make these kind of things happen. And I take all the points that Henning made before, that it's really difficult to do these analyses and it can only be pretty much a guesstimate. But even so, I think it would be important to start to understand whether, as a country, we should be focused on ensuring we have one super high reliability network that the government is going to pour a lot of money into, or can we just leave it to the commercial world and we'll take whatever we can and get away with it? And where do we sit between those two? So that's where I would focus the research, I think.
Great, thank you, William. Anna, and then we'll wrap up with Lisa.
Okay, so policy that would trouble me is sector-specific agencies going beyond their traditional remit to try to regulate the networks. And I'm going to give an example that's not a perfect example, but I don't know if you remember, Vice President Cheney had a defibrillator that was wirelessly connected somehow. And because of concerns about a possible assassination plot, they had to turn off the wireless connectivity. And so that is a worst case scenario risk that really applies to one person, a handful of people around the world. And what you don't want to have is that very unlikely risk driving regulations that then affect the entire system. And that is my worst case scenario way of explaining that my concern is to make sure that we are balancing incentives, balancing economic and security, ensuring that we continue to drive the innovation that has gotten us to where we are today in a way that is that is good for consumers, but also good for the deployment of the technologies.
Great, thank you, Anna, and then Lisa, and then we'll break out into our rooms with Melissa's lead.
Great. Well, fortunately, you guys all said awesome stuff that I really can't add to very much. I guess I would close with reminding folks that what we're trying to say with Zero Trust is not that we have a solution, right? We're not saying we have a new silver bullet. Here it is, it's Zero Trust. We're actually trying to invite people to think deeply about the fact that these are going to be complex systems, that there are going to be vulnerabilities we don't anticipate. Some of that was alluded to, that we do the best that we can to continually learn and improve, but always keep your guard up, because frankly, you've got to be prepared for stuff to go wrong. And so resiliency is really the goal, as opposed to perfect security or perfect trust or all these other terms that can lead you to design things in a way that historically have been proven out to be very, very dangerous, frankly, and to have bad outcomes. So we're really trying to get people to rethink how you approach the design of complex systems, recognizing all the complexities that everybody has highlighted. And there's a lot of work to be done. I could probably spend an hour talking about all the research areas that I think are going to have to be needed to really bring to bear the full fruits of the vision I think that people are excited about with 5G. But we'll leave it at that. And I personally want to thank everybody so far. It's been a really great panel, and I've enjoyed it. And thank you for everybody who's online and listening.
Absolutely. I also want to join in thanking the entire panel. You guys were terrific. I'm sure there'd be a loud round of applause if we were in an auditorium like usual. But with that, I'm going to turn it over. Melissa's coming back on, I believe, and then we're going to adjourn into our breakout rooms.
Thank you.
I think that's happening.
Yes.
There it is.
Well, thank you very much. That was an exciting panel and so many different aspects to consider and think about. I know I learned quite a new avenues I need to go research now. So now we will go into our breakout rooms for a one-on-one interaction with the panelists and moderator. Information on accessing the breakout rooms is in the ISART app, or you can just use the links that was sent in the confirmation email that you received. And a reminder that after the breakouts, ISART 2020 will resume at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. See you soon in the breakouts.